My name is Patrick Foley, and this is my review for Red Africa for UK Film Review. So this film is a around about 60-minute documentary focusing on 30 years between the 1960s to the 1990s, when the Soviet Union looked to grow and establish relationships with newly independent African nations. The film begins with the sort of decolonization process of the British, for example, leaving African states, and then follows through the 60s, 70s, and the 80s as the Soviet Union strikes up agreements and business relationships with these new African nations and their leaders, initially promising all sorts of benefits and wealth that will be generated. But as the film explores, there's actually a lot of a sort of new colonialist element that the USSR was looking to try and extract from some of these African nations. We see natural resources being taken to bring into the Soviet Union, for example. And as the documentary progresses and as the sort of new time periods of the 80s are explored, it becomes evident that the USSR's focus on Africa is really more one way in their eyes than it is to some of these African states. And some of the footage that is found and produced from that time really is quite surreal and eye-opening, as you see a sort of mixture of Soviet Russian communist culture mixed with African traditions. You see a sort of Russian interpretation of what African culture is likely to be as dignitaries from some of these nations are welcome to the USSR, and how just this bizarre kind of internationalist approach from the USSR as they tried to widen their influence in the world produce some really strange and very interesting moments in time. I found the film to be very similar to another documentary series from Adam Curtis that was released last year called Trauma Zone. The style of Red Africa and Trauma Zone are very similar in that they both just present historical footage kind of without any kind of commentary or contribution from people who were there or anything like that. It is purely the footage used to tell its own story and allow the viewer to come to their own conclusions. And like Trauma Zone, it can often jump from thousands of miles within very short time spells. It can be really surreal to see how things are going in Moscow, and then immediately jump to an African state where things are very different, all within the same time period. And then it can leap forward years into a new decade where relationships have changed. It's a very effective technique, I find, for just presenting history as it was, rather than trying to give any sort of certain view or any kind of specific interpretation of that time. It's really on the audience to understand what is being shown and said, and to bring their own understanding of the context into the film. And because of that, there is probably required an understanding of the sort of latter half of the 20th century and Soviet history as well, that is required to really gain the sort of full appreciation for what the film is demonstrating. It really is one for the sort of history nerds, which luckily I would count myself as. If you're unfamiliar with that time or unfamiliar with the kind of events that led to the Soviets' collapse eventually in the 90s, there will be certain times where this film is probably lost. And similarly, the sort of history or modern history of Africa as a continent as well, and how certain states have developed the way they have. It's good to have a grounding before going into this film. And similar to with Trauma Zone, the style does somewhat limit how much can be interpreted by the film in of itself. There really there isn't a sense that the film is just to show this time, that it covers its own subject, and it does feel a little limited when the conclusion's reached. It sort of concludes with the end of the Soviet Union, which is clearly a pivotal global event. But I found, compared to Trauma Zone, which ended with the rise of Putin, who's still obviously a very, very important figure in the world today, it did seem a little bit separated from current events, which dampens it slightly and makes it more of a kind of an interesting look into the past at a certain time, which was quite a novel and generally unexplored period to most audiences who'll be watching this. But in terms of actually really kind of leaving you with a sense of like, this explains the world today, that there is a bit lacking due to the stylist approach of the film. And I particularly felt that, given that the approach the Soviets took in the 20th century is exactly the approach really that China are taking now, whereby they are investing heavily in Africa and making them almost beholden to China's economy and Chinese decisions. And it's this kind of new colonialist control. It does feel like a little bit of a missed opportunity for the film to maybe try and find some links there and end on a note that shows that it is very important that what happened back then does affect today. But all in all, the footage that is presented and the way it's knitted together and the story that is told is remarkable. It's a time that I was not personally greatly aware of, and I imagine that will be true for many of its target audience, and something I found very, very interesting, just seeing how the world was back then, how culture was back then, how the Soviets operated, for example, and told with, as I say, a brilliant knitting together of some incredible footage that really is quite mind-blowing to see. So I'd highly recommend Red Africa for anyone certainly who's interested in history. It is probably quite advanced in its focus, and as I say, it doesn't waste any time getting down to business or feel the need to explain itself or give more context than is really necessary. But if that sounds like the film for you, then this is a really, really insightful and interesting and quite surreal look at a very tumultuous time in the world.